There are certain evenings when Oxford feels less like a city and more like a lingering memory. That October, the air carried a faint, smoky chill, and even the light seemed reluctant to move through it. I had taken my usual place in the corner of the King's Arms, the one nearest the radiator and farthest from the door, and was nursing the second pint I hadn't planned to order. The table bore the stains of 100 unspoken arguments. I was reading an article from the Oxford Review of Ethics, a student's attempt at modern philosophy disguised as moral urgency. It wasn't bad, merely too certain of itself, but it was the footnote that stopped me. A quote from T.S. Eliot misattributed to Auden. An oversight, perhaps. Yet I remember thinking that in Oxford, errors of attribution were never quite innocent. Outside, rain began to strike the leaded windows like someone impatient to be admitted. I folded the journal and watched the reflections in the glass. The blurred halos of the street lamps, the slow procession of umbrellas drifting toward St. Giles's. The city had that peculiar silence that exists only where intellect has exhausted itself for the day. I thought, not for the first time, that there were too many people in Oxford who mistook cleverness for wisdom, myself among them. The porter from St. Saviour's found the body that night. He was a mild, taciturn man named Purcell, who'd once been a gardener before the college decided ivy did not require tending. He told me later, in a voice almost embarrassed by memory, that the light under the door had been burning since afternoon. He'd knocked once, twice, and then used his key. Daniel Crewe, postgraduate in philosophy, lay at his desk, his head resting lightly on an open manuscript. There was no blood, no violence, only the stillness of an argument concluded. The manuscript's title was The Morality of Murder. By the time Lewis and I arrived, the coroner's assistant had finished his routine and was waiting for someone to confirm the obvious. "Suicide," he said, gesturing toward the empty glass and the small amber bottle beside it. The word hung in the air like a wrong note. Lewis crouched near the desk, examining the pages. He said something about the handwriting. Neat, deliberate, not the scrawl of despair. I said nothing. The room was too clean. Even the wastebasket had been emptied. A man preparing to die rarely tidies up so thoroughly. On the window ledge sat a pot of dying heather, the kind one buys out of guilt rather than affection. The rain had worked its way in, darkening the sill. I remember brushing my finger against it and feeling how recently it had been wiped. Whoever had done it had cared, or wished to appear so. Crewe's manuscript, however, was not finished. The final footnote ended abruptly. Moral action derives not from law, but from... And then nothing. A dash, a pause, as though he had been called away mid-thought. I found that more troubling than the empty bottle. Men who take their own lives tend to finish their sentences. Lewis found a student card tucked inside the last chapter, used as a marker. It belonged to a woman, Helena Price, doctoral supervisor, classicist, lecturer in moral philosophy. I had heard the name before, as one hears a line of poetry half remembered but never examined. The chapel bell of St. Saviour's began its slow, sonorous toll. I stepped back into the corridor, the scent of varnish and paper following like a persistent echo. The porter was standing by the staircase, hat in hand, uncertain whether to speak. He said the choir had been practicing that evening. They'd been singing Kyrie Ellison. Lord have mercy. There was nothing to say to that. I merely nodded and left him to his silence. Back in the car, I stared at the rain misting the windscreen until the shapes blurred. Lewis asked whether I believed it was suicide. I told him I didn't believe in tidy deaths. Not in Oxford. There's always a missing comma, a misplaced name, a footnote that stops just short of meaning. Later that night, I opened the student journal again and ran my finger beneath the misattributed line. I couldn't have said why, but I knew I would find the same kind of error somewhere in Daniel Crewe's last work. An act of correction so precise it betrayed its author. That was the beginning of it. A small, quiet mistake, lodged like a seed in the mind, waiting to grow into something unforgivable. It is a strange thing, how quickly the air of a room begins to rearrange itself once the police have gone. When Lewis and I returned to St. Saviour's the next morning, the study where Daniel Crewe had died no longer felt like a place of inquiry, but of faint embarrassment, as though death were an untidy guest overstaying his welcome. The curtains had been drawn aside, light striking the desk with the bluntness of reason. The manuscript still lay there, though someone had closed it neatly, as one might shut the eyes of the dead. Lewis stood by the bookcase, studying the rows of volumes with that mild expression he wears when trying to make sense of the unsensible. He asked what I thought of it all. I told him that the room seemed to me too symmetrical, every object aligned as if death had followed a blueprint. He said it was tidy because Crewe was meticulous. I said that even the meticulous forget to dust their own mortality. The coroner's report, waiting on the table, made its usual concessions to chemistry and sequence. Barbiturates, high concentration, empty stomach. No sign of struggle. A brief note, unsigned, in the wastebasket. I'm sorry for the noise I've made in life. Lewis read it twice and said that it sounded final enough. I told him it sounded literary. The dead rarely edit their apologies. There was, however, something else. The smell. Not the chemical faintness of death, but something subtler, deliberate, printer's ink, still fresh. It clung to the manuscript pages and to the fingertips of anyone who turned them. Crewe, I learned later, had been in the college print room that evening, supposedly finalizing his thesis submission. Yet the manuscript on the desk was not the same version the department received. His tutor, Helena Price, had signed for a bound copy at noon that day, which begged a question. What, then, had he been printing that night? A porter entered to collect the tea things, his eyes avoiding the desk. He said Crewe had been quiet lately. Spent long hours by the chapel window, watching the choir practice. The sound carried through the quadrangle. Kyrie Ellison, over and over, Mercy begged in Latin. I asked whether anyone had visited him that evening. The porter hesitated, said he thought he'd heard voices around 8. A woman, perhaps. But then again, it might have been the radio. Oxford is full of ghosts that sound like people. I moved toward the shelves, tracing the spines. Philosophy, theology, a few slim books of poetry. Between 2 volumes of Nietzsche, a slip of paper protruded slightly. I eased it free, a torn fragment of typescript, the bottom of a page. A footnote, again truncated mid-thought. One must ask whether the morality of an act depends upon its witness or its secrecy. And then gone, as though the answer had been swallowed. Lewis asked if it meant anything. I told him that it was the same as the missing line in the manuscript. Unfinished thought disguised as resolution. Suicide demands punctuation, not ellipsis. When we left, the rain had begun again, persistent, whispering along the stone cloisters. I paused under the archway, watching it drip through the ancient gargoyles' mouths, each drop a small erasure of the night before. The college chapel bell tolled once, uncertainly. Lewis muttered something about lunch. I told him to go ahead. I wanted to look at the quadrangle a little longer. There was something about the angle of the window above Crewe's room, how it caught the weak morning light and reflected it downward. In the puddle below, the reflection of the tower seemed broken, misaligned, as if the building itself were unsure of its architecture. A small illusion, but I have learned to trust such things. Every crime, like every truth, begins with a fracture in symmetry. That evening, back in my flat, I read Crewe's note again under the lamplight. The handwriting was even, almost elegant, but there was a faint indentation beneath the last line, as if he had begun to write something else and then thought better of it. I tilted the paper against the bulb until the shadows revealed a ghost of a word. Only the tail of an S, the curve of an A perhaps, the beginning of a name. It was not the finality of suicide I felt in that line, but interruption. A voice cut short mid-confession. Oxford has a talent for silencing its own, and somewhere in that silence, I thought, someone was still listening. There's a particular kind of stillness that belongs only to colleges in mourning. It is not grief exactly, but the discomfort of intellect confronted by something it cannot rationalize. St. Saviour's wore it like a winter coat that morning. Even the pigeons seemed subdued, pacing along the parapets as though in contemplative attendance. Lewis and I crossed the quadrangle to the senior common room, where the air was thick with the odor of coffee and apprehension. The dons had gathered there under the pretext of collegial solidarity, though what each wanted was reassurance that the college's reputation would not suffer. I recognized the type, the moral philosophers who discuss virtue between committee meetings and forget to return library books on ethics. Dr. Helena Price was seated by the fire, her expression composed, her hands clasped too tightly to belong to indifference. She was Crewe's supervisor. She spoke in the low, deliberate tones of someone who believed clarity to be a moral duty. Daniel had been brilliant, she said, and fragile. His work consumed him. I asked whether she had read his final thesis. She nodded, a fraction too quickly. It was gifted, she said, but disturbing. He had grown obsessed with the notion that morality and murder shared a common logic. Professor Mallory, the warden, hovered near the sideboard, stirring his tea with unnecessary precision. He was the sort who regarded emotion as an untidy form of reasoning. He reminded me that genius often walked a narrow path. I replied that so did murder. He looked away, pretending not to hear. 3 of Crewe's fellow students drifted in later. Ede, a thin man with a permanent smirk. Robson, who wore melancholy as a badge of sensitivity, and a quiet woman named Lydia Holt, whose eyes seemed to record everything without comment. They had all attended the departmental seminar that afternoon, hours before the death. Lewis, ever methodical, asked routine questions. Who last saw Crewe, whether he had seemed despondent, whether he had mentioned his manuscript. Each answered dutifully, but not sincerely. I listened more to what they didn't say. Ede's fingers trembled slightly when he mentioned Helena's name. Robson spoke of Crewe with the reverence of someone describing his own reflection. Lydia looked only at the floor, as though reading something there that the rest of us had overlooked. When I asked whether Crewe had enemies, Helena interjected with an almost maternal briskness. Daniel, she said, was incapable of hatred, which meant, of course, that someone had hated him enough for both. During a pause, Mallory fetched a folded newspaper from his coat. The Oxford Mail had already run its piece, promising students' tragic death at St. Saviour's. He remarked that the press would be merciless. I noted that he had underlined a sentence. Police treat the matter as suicide. He said it was important to establish the narrative early. I said narratives are for novels, not autopsies. He smiled, thinly, and asked if I read many novels. Only the ones that end badly, I told him. When the meeting dispersed, I lingered in the study. The rain had started again, tapping at the leaded panes like a polite question. Helena remained by the fire, staring into the flames as if translating them into Latin. I asked whether Crewe had left any personal correspondence. She hesitated, then said there had been a letter, a few lines only, but she had destroyed it. I asked why. She said it was too painful. I wondered aloud whether pain and guilt often wore the same perfume. She looked up then, sharply, but said nothing. Outside, Lewis fell into step beside me. He asked what I'd made of them. A circle of scholars, I said. Tight, self-regarding, and terrified of contamination. He frowned. Contamination of what? Of truth, I suppose. It seeps through even the most polished minds. As we reached the gate, the porter approached with a message. Crewe's parents had arrived in Oxford, unannounced. I took the scrap of paper with their address, and in that moment a thought flickered. Something Helena had said earlier, too quickly to notice at the time. His work consumed him. A cliché, perhaps, but her phrasing had been curious. Not he consumed himself with work, but his work consumed him. The active subject reversed, as though the manuscript itself had been doing the devouring. It was a small thing, barely a ripple of syntax, but I have learned that murder often hides in grammar. The bells began to sound across the city, distant and irregular, their echoes mingling with the rain. Oxford, once again, was washing its conscience. There are moments in an investigation when absence feels louder than presence, when what has been taken or destroyed begins to shout from the silence it leaves behind. That morning, as the mist curled along the Cherwell and the punts lay tethered like forgotten intentions, I felt that silence pressing in. Daniel Crewe had left a letter. Helena Price had said so, though later she denied it with the precision of someone accustomed to academic revision. She had spoken of it once, instinctively, before remembering the decorum of omission. Lewis and I returned to Crewe's rooms under the pretext of collecting papers. The porter handed us the key with a look that might have been superstition. The room was precisely as before, tidy, over-considered, almost antiseptic. But there was one small change. On the mantel, among the usual relics of student vanity, lay a cheap brass typewriter, ribbon tin, recently polished. I opened it. Empty. Lewis said perhaps the coroner had removed the ribbon. I said the coroner wasn't in the habit of editing prose. The typewriter itself sat squarely on the desk, carriage-centered as if waiting for instructions. I fed a blank sheet through and pressed a key. The impression was shallow. No ink, no resistance. The ribbon had indeed been removed, not carelessly but carefully wound off the spools. Someone had taken the record of Crewe's last words. The thought had a certain grim elegance. Lewis busied himself with drawers and shelves while I stood by the window, listening to the faint hum of the college boiler through the pipes. I remembered Helena's voice when she told me about the letter. The quick intake of breath afterward, the soft correction that followed. He'd written something to her, she'd said. Only a few lines. Nothing important. People always call unimportant what they wish to forget. In the desk I found a small notebook of crossword grids, most half-finished. One clue had been circled in pencil, one who corrects errors, 10 letters. The answer space was left blank. I murmured it aloud, and Lewis, still searching through papers, suggested perfectionist. I said that was 12. He shrugged and said proofreader, 11. Then editor, 6. I looked at the blank line again and said quietly that there was another possibility. Murderess. He glanced up at me, half smiling, uncertain whether I was joking. So was I. Later that afternoon I walked alone to the Philosophy Building, an austere cube of concrete softened by ivy. Helena Price's office was small, lined with shelves that leaned toward one another like conspirators. She sat behind her desk, her posture immaculate, her eyes patient. I asked about the missing letter. She said she had been mistaken. There had been no letter, only a note of dedication in the thesis itself. Something sentimental, perhaps misinterpreted by the porter. I told her that the porter had never mentioned it. Her composure faltered for a heartbeat. Then she smiled, the kind of smile that closes a door without making a sound. Before I left, I noticed a slip of paper pinned above her desk. A quotation, handwritten in blue ink. Justice turns the wheel. The line is from Aeschylus, but inaccurately rendered. The original reads, "Justice turns the balance." It is the kind of misquotation only a scholar too certain of herself would make. I said nothing. There are times when the correction of an error reveals more than the error itself. Outside, the afternoon light had thinned to a pale translucence, the kind that makes Oxford look perpetually half-remembered. A group of students crossed the quad, their laughter dissonant against the damp air. I stopped by the college gate and looked back toward Helena's window. A silhouette moved within. Hers, perhaps, or some other ghost of propriety. That evening I poured a measure of whiskey and sat at my desk, reading Crewe's Thesis again. On the final page I noticed a faint smudge where a line had been erased and retyped, a small imperfection in the symmetry. I tilted it toward the lamp and caught the trace of an earlier phrase beneath. "You will see." It was not a threat. It was an invitation, and in the economy of murder, such invitations are seldom declined. Oxford wears deceit more elegantly than most cities. It drapes itself in reason, in footnotes and footpaths, until one can hardly tell where learning ends and evasion begins. That evening, the lights of St. Saviour's glowed like the last embers of a dying argument, and I found myself standing once more beneath its archways, listening to rain whisper through stone. The warden, Professor Mallory, had agreed to see us. His message had been polite to the point of parody. A request for clarity, though what he truly wanted was reassurance that intellect still conferred immunity. Mallory received us in his study, a large airless chamber where books had been arranged less for use than display. He offered whiskey, which I declined, though not easily. His manner was practiced, each word chosen like a citation. He spoke of Crewe's brilliance, of the loss to philosophy, to the college, to himself. His tone was steady, but I sensed the faint tremor beneath it. Not grief, but calculation. He mentioned having been at the donors' dinner that night, a small formal affair at the Randolph. Lewis noted it in his book, and I asked what time he had left. "Around 10, Mallory said, though his eyes drifted slightly to the right, as if consulting an invisible clock. He had gone home, he said, to read proofs. Alone. It was the kind of alibi that depends on one's reputation rather than evidence. I asked whether anyone could confirm it. He smiled with weary patience, as though the question itself were ungentlemanly. The porter might have seen him return, he said. Or not. Time is elastic in colleges. Nobody watches the gate. As he spoke, I found my gaze drawn to a photograph on his desk. The College Debating Society, 15 years earlier. Among the rows of black gowns and awkward smiles, a younger Mallory stood beside Helena Price. Her hand rested lightly on his shoulder. The gesture was unremarkable, yet her face betrayed a look of quiet possession, the sort of intimacy Oxford likes to pretend doesn't exist. I asked whether he and Dr. Price were close. His pause was brief, but not brief enough. "We have collaborated," he said. "Academic proximity, nothing more." Lewis coughed, the sound of disbelief politely disguised as a throat clearing. When we left, I told Lewis to check with the hotel. If Mallory had been at the dinner until 10, someone would have seen him leave. A waiter, a colleague, a bored wife waiting for dessert. Lewis nodded and went off muttering about timetables. I lingered in the quad, watching the lamplight tremble across the wet flagstones. Somewhere behind the chapel, a piano was playing. Chopin, hesitant, as though remembering the notes too late. Later, back at the station, Lewis returned with the look of a man who wished the world less complicated. The maitre d' had confirmed Mallory's attendance, yes, but also that he'd departed before the speeches, around 8:30. The rain that night had been heavy. He'd refused an umbrella, a strange choice for a man so careful about appearances. I asked whether Mallory had been seen returning to college. Lewis shook his head. Nobody had. We sat in silence for a while. The sound of the typewriter from the adjoining office echoed faintly. Each keystroke another unanswered question. Then Lewis said he'd spoken to Simon Eade, one of Crewe's fellow students. Eade claimed he'd heard typing from Crewe's room late that night. I reminded him that the typewriter had no ribbon. It was a small contradiction, yet contradictions are the pulse of truth. If Endeavour had heard typing, someone had wanted him to. The rhythm of those false keystrokes, I could almost hear them, would have sounded like thought itself, steady, deliberate, convincing. The imitation of life performed by an absent man. Before turning in, I poured myself the whiskey I had earlier refused. The rain had resumed, finer now, almost invisible against the lamplight. Oxford looked washed of colour, its secrets rinsed but not erased. I thought of Mallory's photograph, Helena's hand, the quiet ownership in her gaze, and of the missing ribbon that had carried the last words of Daniel Crewe. People often think lies are told in words, but in Oxford, the truest lies are told in silences carefully curated and in alibis constructed from the fragile architecture of intellect. I finished my drink and wondered, not for the first time, whether knowledge itself was just another way of hiding. It was a morning thick with drizzle, the kind that seems to rise from the cobblestones rather than fall upon them. The college looked blurred, as though someone had smudged it gently with a damp thumb. Lewis walked beside me in silence, his collar turned up, his mind, I suspected, already elsewhere. We were returning to St. Saviour's to collect Crewe's manuscript, the official copy, the one submitted to the department before his death. I had read enough of the version found beside his body to know there would be differences. The question, as always, was which version told the truth. The departmental secretary handed it over reluctantly, wrapped in brown paper and string, like something faintly indecent. She said it had been reviewed by Dr. Price the day before Crewe's death. Her tone suggested reverence or fear. I thanked her and carried it out beneath my arm like an unwanted confession. Back in my flat, I untied the string and laid the pages out across the table. The smell of fresh paper mingled with the faint metallic tang of printer's ink. Familiar, almost intimate. I began to read, slowly, aloud in parts, for rhythm often betrays revision. The arguments were sharp, perhaps too sharp. Crewe had written of morality as though it were a chess problem, the player detached, the pieces merely extensions of thought. Yet in several sections, the prose shifted subtly. Same vocabulary, different pulse. Certain lines bent toward a different voice, softer but more deliberate, as though another hand had guided them. I turned to the margins. There, in pale pencil, was a series of notes. The handwriting wasn't Crewe's. It was more refined, slightly slanted, a scholar's hand used to the quiet authority of correction. The first note read, "Too absolute. Reconsider moral premise." The second, "He will not forgive this phrasing." I sat back. Forgive. A curious verb for an academic comment. Lewis came in later with sandwiches and tea. He stood by the table, glancing at the pages as though they might rearrange themselves under his gaze. I told him to look at the handwriting. He squinted, said it looked feminine. I asked him to find anything signed by Helena Price. Department memos, meeting notes, anything. He returned an hour later with a folder of papers from her office, each bearing her signature. The comparison required no forensic training. The same hand, the same graceful austerity. I poured us both tea, though neither of us drank it. It had grown cold by the time I spoke again. If she corrected his manuscript, I said, she must have had access to it after submission. Lewis frowned. Maybe she helped him with it earlier, he suggested. She was his supervisor, after all. I told him that help leaves fingerprints of encouragement, not ownership. These notes weren't guidance. They were possession. He asked whether it mattered. Crewe was dead, and Price had merely done what academics do: polish, perfect, refine. I looked at the final page. The last paragraph had been typed over another. Under the lamplight, faint impressions of the earlier words pressed through like ghosts beneath a thin veil. I tilted it, reading what I could. He spoke of moral law, but lived by appetite. It was the same line that reappeared, in altered form, near the middle of the paper. This time without the he. The pronoun had been erased, dissolved into abstraction. The personal made theoretical. That was Helena's touch, turning confession into philosophy. When Lewis left, the rain had strengthened, pooling along the sills. I lit a cigarette, something I do less often now, and watched the smoke thread its way toward the ceiling. The manuscript lay open beside me, the pencil annotations faintly glimmering under the lamplight. I thought of her phrase from our first conversation. His work consumed him, and wondered whose hunger she had really meant. Somewhere in the distance, a church clock struck 4. I sat there a while longer, listening to its echo fading through the mist, thinking how the truth, like marginalia, often hides in the faintest handwriting, noticed only by those who refuse to stop reading. There are few moments in police work so unnerving as a confession that arrives too easily. It sits there, heavy with its own convenience, offering a kind of premature relief that any thinking man ought to distrust. Simone Ada's confession came that way. Deliberate, rehearsed, almost courteous. He had asked to see me alone. The interview room smelled faintly of disinfectant and rain-damp wool. He sat opposite, shoulders squared but eyes restless, the way a student faces an examination he has already failed in his mind. He said he had killed Daniel Crewe. He said it twice, as though repetition could turn the statement into truth. I let him speak. Jealousy, he called it. Competition. An argument that turned too sharp, too human. He described shoving Crewe in a fit of temper, watching him fall, then arranging the scene to look like suicide. The details were immaculate, a little too immaculate. When a man confesses from guilt, the story falters. Verbs lose courage, nouns stumble. Edie's words ran like ink on a polished page. I asked him how Crewe looked when he died. He said peaceful. The word landed badly, like a coin dropped on stone. He claimed the typewriter had been used after the fall to make it seem as though Crewe had written until the end. Yet he never mentioned the missing ribbon, nor the erased line beneath the final page. Lewis sat in the corner, his silence dutiful. When Ade left, escorted back to his room's pending paperwork, Lewis said it sounded clean enough. I told him nothing in Oxford was ever clean. He frowned, then said, "Maybe guilt doesn't always tell the truth." It was late when I returned to the college. The corridors smelled of chalk dust and old varnish. Outside Crewe's door, the porter hovered with that superstitious unease that lingers long after tragedy. He asked if it was over. I said it never is. He looked relieved anyway. People always prefer conclusion to accuracy. Inside the study, I switched on the desk lamp. The beam pooled across the papers like interrogation light. I studied the typewriter again, its keys glinting dully, its carriage resting at the center as if waiting to resume a sentence left unfinished. I pressed one key lightly. The faint click echoed in the silence. I could almost hear Ida's story forming around it, neat and circular, too circular. On the shelf above, the crossword book remained where I had left it. I turned to the page with the circled clue. One who corrects errors, 10 letters. In the margin, a smudge of graphite extended beyond the circle, as though someone had begun to fill the space, then hesitated. I counted the boxes. 10 letters. Yes. The solution fit perfectly, but it wasn't Edie's. Murderous. I closed the book and sat down. The rain was beginning again, light and relentless, the sort that never quite reaches the ground. I thought of Helena Price, her composed hands, her careful diction, her strange blend of intellect and reticence. She had spoken of Daniel's mind with admiration, tinged by injury. She had once used the same word as Ede, peaceful, when describing his final work, and she too had edited his pages, inserting her judgment between his thoughts. Perhaps she had been editing him long before he died. Lewis called from the doorway. He said the chief would be pleased. A confession, a motive, the matter tidily concluded. I told him that neat endings belonged to fiction, and that philosophy, not murder, was Crewe's chosen subject. He hesitated, then asked what I was thinking. That some confessions absolve the wrong soul, I said, and that Daniel Crewe had written one of his own, not in ink, but between the margins someone else tried to erase. He waited for me to go on. I didn't. Outside, the bells of St. Mary's began to toll the hour. Slow, deliberate, faintly discordant. The sound followed us through the quadrangle like an unanswered question. I've heard that sound many times since, though I am never certain which hour it belongs to. The hour of guilt, or the hour when truth chooses to remain politely unsaid. There are moments when sound tells you what words cannot, when silence itself hums with the residue of what's been done. That evening, I returned to St. Saviour's not for answers, but for the texture of them. Rain had begun again, the patient kind that erases footprints without haste. From somewhere in the depths of the college came the faint notes of a piano, a hesitant thread of melody unraveling through the corridors. It was Schubert, the impromptu in G-flat, a piece that pretends to be gentle until you listen closely. Helena Price was playing. Her door stood slightly ajar, the light from her desk lamp cutting a thin path across the parquet floor. She did not stop when I entered. She merely acknowledged me with the smallest tilt of the head, as though we were two weary passengers sharing the same train compartment. When she finished, she let her hands rest on the keys a moment longer than necessary. I asked if it was Crewe's favorite piece. She said it was hers. Then, after a pause, that he had hated it. The room was spare. No personal clutter, only books, files, and the faint trace of perfume that doesn't quite reach sweetness. On her desk lay a pile of student essays, and beside them a wine glass, half drunk and forgotten. I asked how she'd been sleeping. She said she found sleep overrated, that consciousness was punishment enough. The words carried no self-pity, only fatigue. We spoke of Crewe, carefully, as though his name might break the air. She said he was brilliant, but cruel in the way clever men sometimes are, always testing the fragility of others. I asked whether she felt he had tested hers. She looked at me for a long time, then asked what kind of question that was. I told her it was the only kind worth asking. The clock on the mantel ticked between us, too loud. She rose, poured herself more wine, and stood by the window. I noticed her reflection in the glass. Blurred, doubled, like someone half-remembered. She asked whether I believed in redemption. I said I believed in the desire for it, which is never quite the same. A gust of wind caught the window pane and rattled it sharply. She flinched, a reflex too quick for her usual composure. I asked whether she had seen Crewe the seas. Night he died. Her eyes did not move from the rain outside. She said she hadn't. Then she added quietly that she had dreamed of him, sitting at his desk, still writing, still explaining himself. Dreams, she said, are the mind's cruelest editors. I let the silence stretch, long enough for the music to return faintly in my head. The impromptu, its hesitant repetitions, its unresolved cadences. Schubert had written it while dying. There was something fitting in that, I supposed. Beauty mistaken for serenity. I looked again at her desk. Among the papers lay an envelope, unsealed, its corner marked with the college crest. A draft of a departmental recommendation letter, perhaps, or something else. One line of handwriting showed through faintly in pencil beneath the ink. 2 words, "Forgive me." I said nothing. The confession had already been made, just not to me. She noticed my glance, reached for the envelope, and with the calm of habit, slipped it into a drawer. When she turned back, her face was smooth again, almost indifferent. As I left, she began to play once more. The same piece, the same weary tenderness. Yet this time she missed a note, just one, small and jarring, enough to startle the listener into wakefulness. I paused outside the door, listening as the melody recovered, reshaped itself around the absence. That's how guilt works, I thought. It doesn't silence the music. It changes its phrasing. By the time I reached the quad, the sound had faded into rain. Lewis was waiting by the gate, his coat soaked, his patience thinning. He asked what she'd said. I told him she'd been playing Schubert. He sighed, muttered something about music not solving murders. Perhaps not, I said. But it reveals who cannot stop listening. We walked toward the car without speaking again. The rain kept its own rhythm, persistent, unresolved, like the final bar of a piece that refuses to end. There are details that lie dormant for days, harmless, unprovocative, until they rise again and change everything. For me, it was a single line of poetry. I was walking through Radcliffe Square the evening, pressing down like a closing book, when the phrase surfaced unbidden in my mind. Between the motion and the act falls the shadow. I had read it first in Crewe's manuscript. He had attributed it wrongly to Auden. I remember thinking, absently, that it was an error born of haste. Yet it wasn't. Not for Crewe. He was meticulous, to the point of arrogance, which meant the mistake belonged to someone else. Back at the flat, I opened the copy of The Morality of Murder that still lay on my desk. The misquotation glared from the page like an ink blot. Between the motion and the thought falls the shadow. Thought, not act. It had been changed. The line had been edited after his death. Only one person, perhaps, would have dared to correct him, and gotten it wrong. I found Helena Price's essay, the one she had published 2 years earlier, in the Ethics Quarterly. There it was again, precisely the same misquotation, a scholar's fingerprint, elegant and damning. I sat for a long while, listening to the ticking of the clock and the faint hum of rain beyond the window. The truth never arrives with fanfare. It drifts quietly like the smell of dust on an old jacket. I went to see her the next morning. She was lecturing in the small hall off New College Lane. A modest audience, mostly young faces, half listening. She spoke of Aristotle's telos, of moral purpose and the difficulty of knowing whether good can ever be done without vanity. Her voice had the clarity of something carefully rehearsed, but her eyes kept searching the faces before her as though for forgiveness. When the lecture ended, I waited in the doorway. She saw me, hesitated, and then gathered her papers with the precision of someone who cannot afford a tremor. We walked through the cloisters together. She said the inquest was tomorrow, that she would attend if required. I told her it wouldn't be necessary. The coroner had already reached his conclusion. She asked whether I agreed with it. I said I didn't agree with anything that tidy. The wind turned through the archway, lifting the hem of her coat. She looked at me then, properly, as though trying to measure how much I already knew. I asked whether she had ever read Eliot. Of course, she said. I asked whether she preferred motion or thought. For a moment, she didn't understand. Then she stopped walking. The pause stretched thin between us. She said softly that Daniel had been ungrateful, that his genius was poisonous, that he had taken everything, her time, her reputation, her sense of moral gravity, and left her nothing but the echo of his arguments. I asked if she had corrected him. She smiled, faintly. Only in the margins, she said. There was a kind of honesty in her fatigue. I have always known that guilt, like love, wears many disguises. Some confess through trembling, others through grammar. Helena's had been written in a single substitution, thought for act. She had turned murder into abstraction. When we parted, she went back through the archway, her figure dissolving into the drizzle. I remained a moment longer, looking up at the sky, pale, uncommitted, the color of an unwritten page. Somewhere behind the chapel windows, the choir had begun rehearsal. The first note, low, uncertain, drifted outward and broke against the stone. Miserere me Deus. Have mercy. I walked away slowly. I did not yet know what I would do, or whether justice could be anything more than another of Oxford's beautiful illusions. But I knew that the line in the manuscript, that small, misplaced word, had ceased to be a scholar's error. It was a confession, delicately phrased, buried in plain sight. Between the motion and the act, yes, but also between the word and the silence, the shadow always falls. There is a particular stillness that settles over Oxford after midnight, a silence so complete it feels less like the absence of sound than its deliberate withdrawal. That night, the city seemed to hold its breath. I had been sitting by the window of my flat for some time, the light from the lamp turning the whiskey in my glass, the color of regret. The manuscript lay open on the table beside me, its pages slightly curled at the edges, as though uneasy in their own skin. Helena Price had come to the station earlier that evening. No appointment, no formal request. She walked in quietly, the rain still clinging to her coat, and asked to see me. Lewis had offered her tea, which she declined. She said she wished to return something. I'd known before she opened her hand what it would be. The typewriter ribbon, neatly wound, the spool marked faintly by the pressure of words long since unspoken. She placed it on my desk without ceremony. Her eyes looked different, not broken, but finished. I told her she didn't have to say anything, though she did. She said that Daniel's mind had been a room she could not leave, that she had entered it once out of admiration, then out of love, and finally out of necessity. He had begun to write about her, about their affair, about the philosophy of possession disguised as ethics. He said that the only way to test moral truth was through the act itself. He called it empirical conscience. She said she had told him he was wrong, that morality could never be proved, only lived. When she finished speaking, I found myself thinking of Crewe's unfinished sentence. Moral action derives not from law, but from... And how the dash that followed had always felt like an invitation. Perhaps she had supplied the ending herself. Perhaps she believed she was answering him, not silencing him. The ribbon sat between us like a verdict. She asked if I would arrest her. I said that wasn't my decision to make tonight. She nodded, as though the idea of consequence had already been accounted for. When she rose to leave, she looked lighter, as if confession had made her slightly transparent. I watched her walk down the corridor, unhurried, graceful, alone. There are departures in Oxford that no one witnesses but the walls. After she left, Lewis came in. He looked at the ribbon, then at me, and asked whether that was it. I told him there's no such thing as it. He said something about justice being served, though he didn't sound convinced. I poured him a drink, which he didn't take. He asked whether I believed she'd meant to kill him. I said intent is a word lawyers use to make tragedy sound deliberate. When he was gone, I stayed a while longer, reading Crewe's final pages again. The words were sharp, arrogant, brilliant. But somewhere beneath them ran another voice, quieter, feminine, correcting his certainties line by line. I traced the faint impression of her edits and wondered if that was her real confession. Not the killing, but the revision. She had rewritten the truth until it fit the grammar of her guilt. Outside, the first light of morning began to seep through the curtains. It caught the edge of the manuscript, the spool, the half-empty glass. Small relics of a case that had never really been about murder. It had been about thought and its consequences, about the ways we use intellect to excuse what the heart cannot forgive. I rose, switched off the lamp, and stood by the window. The city below was waking, the river mist curling like smoke, bicycles beginning their silent procession, the bells of St. Mary's measuring out the hour. Somewhere in those slow chimes was the echo of Eliot's line. Between the motion and the act falls the shadow. But I thought, not for the first time, that perhaps it wasn't a warning after all. Perhaps the shadow was mercy, and perhaps, in its muted way, balance had been restored.